views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey there, good evening. Welcome to the Bronx Buzz. As you probably know, we've been talking about it every week for 6 years. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors, journalists, anybody putting stuff out in print. We also, on occasion, do photographers and filmmakers and videographers and people who do the visual arts. But this evening, we're going to have two different journalists talking to us, and we're going to get started with our longtime friend, Eileen Markey, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Lehman, but an author. Here's proof. Radical Faith is one of her books. Nice to see you, Eileen.
Lovely to be with you, Gary.
You wrote an op-ed piece in the Daily News that caught my eye, where Bronx housing went awry. And you took a look at Twin Parks. That was the building that had that terrible tragedy and that tragic fire that could very well have been presented. So I guess I'm just going to ask you in general, the title of the piece, where did Bronx housing go awry that unfortunately led us to this and other difficult issues?
Yeah, well, when we stopped thinking about housing as a place where people live, as a place where families are created and people have their home as a building block of society, and really in a very accelerated fashion in the last 10 years, have moved to understand housing as profit. Obviously, we've always had private property and it works well in many cases. But what I saw thinking about the Twin Parks fire is there was so much attention rightly paid to that horrible tragedy, and really, news coverage of it all over the world. I was getting, as I think anybody who lives in the Bronx was getting, texts and emails and Facebook messages and whatnot from friends all around the world, right? Being like, oh my God, I saw that fire. How are you?
I have to interject. I had actually people ask me if I was okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't live anywhere near there. Certainly we have extreme care for anybody who's affected. But I was like, wow, it became worldwide news. And of course that emblemizes the Bronx in certain ways.
It does, right? It reminded,
Oh,
it reminded people, right, of really bad old days, and it just became this headline all around the world. Because it was a terrible, horrible tragedy, and it caught people's imagination, and it was an outrage. And then, there was really excellent coverage of it. I teach journalism, so I was obviously paying attention to.
And that's really interesting to me in and of itself. You thought the coverage was good.
There was so much coverage, and then eventually,
right,
within a couple of days, it became much deeper, right? Like, so pretty quickly, news organizations that don't usually do anything near investigative reporting were digging in and reading the HPD reports. We're going into Akers and we're reading the mortgages, right?
And it was like, how can this possibly happen, especially when it was so eminently preventable? I mean, let's face it, just close a couple of doors. Not to say you wouldn't have had a fire or a problem, but you certainly wouldn't have had the kind of destruction and devastation.
Exactly. And so because there was so much attention to this one fire, I wanted to look a little bit more deeply at it and to think a little bit more critically about it. And of course, anybody who pays attention to housing in the Bronx, pays attention to rental issues, knows there are hundreds of buildings in the Bronx that are in really terrible condition that have far worse, actually, housing violation records than Twin Parks did, right? Like hundreds of code violations just year after year.
I mean, I'm taking a deep breath because don't we know it? I mean, I've been sitting in this seat for 27 years, I'm telling you.
Yeah, I wrote a big
way
piece
back then
for The Voice in almost a year ago now, looking at all of the horrible conditions in this, one of the worst landlords, Park Hash's buildings. He's only one name, right? Every year the public advocate puts out a list of the worst landlords in the city, and they own dozens of buildings, and people are living in terrible conditions. Twin Parks was actually not an outlier in that regard.
but I'm going to pull a quote out of your writing, and it said the building exists really as a means of transferring public money to private individuals. What I was not aware of, maybe I was vaguely aware that this was a Mitchell-Lama project, which frankly has been one of the best housing concepts you could ever have, and yet it's no longer in Mitchell-Lama. Let's talk about that transition in relation to the concept that all of a
Sure.
sudden it's not for the public, but it's for the private enterprises.
Sure. I mean, New York City is a company town. Real estate is the business in New York, right? If you think about, steel mills in Pittsburgh several generations ago, here what we have is real estate. And for that reason, real estate has a tremendous influence on public policy, on how our governance works. We also have, housing that is very, very expensive, and we have rich people in New York, and we have a lot of middle class people, and we have a lot of poor people, and you need to find ways for everybody to live in a decent affordable housing. And so the state has all these complicated interventions into the private market to try to preserve some level of housing that regular people can afford to live in. And
Right.
Mitchell-Lama was one of those, developed in the years after World War II, when there's a housing shortage, right, with all these returning GIs, a really useful public-private partnership kind of program. And many of these, it's based on tax subsidies. Many of those buildings started to exit regulation about 15, 20 years ago.
And I'll interject just to move it along, because people feel like if it was private, I could sell my apartment, I could make some money. The downside is that you are then taking this public-private partnership concept and moving it into somebody who may not really give a hoot about
Right.
how
So
well you're doing.
what I wrote about in the Daily News was really just trying to get people to pay attention to the fact that Twin Parks is not unique, right? Twin Parks, unfortunately, there's a lot of buildings that are in bad shape in terms of their maintenance. And even bigger than that issue is this issue that there's been so much investment in Bronx real estate that a lot of that sentence you quoted, that it exists as a means of transferring wealth to private individuals, right? As the state and city are trying to figure out ways to keep some buildings affordable, keep the rents at a level that normal people could afford, we do that by really cajoling and begging private landlords into keeping rents at a certain level. And we do that by giving them all kinds of tax breaks and subsidies and loan guarantees and management fees to run the affordable building. And if you're the landlord in that case, I mean, it's a great deal, right? Like
Right.
you have to
And
keep the
if
rents
you
at a
do,
certain level. It's true, and they're regulated, and you can't just willy-nilly raise them. And but in many cases, people are using programs to pay for that, so the money is very much guaranteed, right? Like by the government.
so if
And
they
they're
don't
getting these
care,
fees. Yeah,
so if they don't care, then this is what you're alleging and what you're suggesting is this is the outcome of it, right? I mean,
right.
that
The
the
way to
outcome
make
is they
money
let it go.
the way to make money running a building that has regulated rents is to put as little as you can into maintenance. That is the way to make money, right? There's so many nonprofit affordable housing management companies and developers in the Bronx, right? Like, this is how the Bronx was rebuilt, right?
Right.
With nonprofit housing organizations. Those organizations, when you look at their books, they tend to put 75% of their rent roll back into the building, into maintenance,
Right.
right? So you take out $100, you get that in rent roll, right? And me and you and all of our neighbors paying our rent, 75 dollars of that 100 goes back into paying for the boiler and fixing the paint and repairing the self-closing doors and fixing the
And
elevator.
you're not, that money does not go into somebody's pockets or percentages of that, who are doing it to make a profit.
So in privately owned buildings, especially these buildings that are owned by big investment firms like what Twin Parks was, it's 30% of the rent roll goes back into maintenance. That's
Wow.
where you make the money, between
And
75%
then
and 30.
right, and then the cost is the condition of the
And the
building and
cost is
everything
the
else.
condition of the building.
You did something that I had never thought about, but it made a ton of sense in the framework that you've painted for us just now. You compared what happened there to the burning of the Bronx in the 70s. I thought that was fascinating because, of course, they burnt it for the insurance money because it was just like, moving property to them. They said, well, let's just get rid of it. We can do better without it. And it didn't matter what happened to the people, largely immigrants and people of color, by the way, who lived in those buildings. Right. I mean, I thought it was Eileen, I thought it was brilliant.
I mean, you see the poster behind me from that Decade of Fire movie.
Oh, there it is. Yes.
You can't think about real estate and fire in the Bronx and not think about the 70s. I know the borough has moved on. There's all sorts of wonderful and important and good things that have happened since then, and they're very much worth talking about and thinking about. But one of the reasons that the Twin Parks story hit people so viscerally, and certainly the reason it was covered on media all around the world, is that it tagged back to that memory. David Gonzalez wrote that absolutely amazing essay in the Times about a week later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course, like there's a fire here, and it makes people think about that. That's why it got covered. And the difference now, I mean, it's very different, right? Like this fire was not intentionally set. There's no allegation that that's what happened. It was a bad accident, but it was an accident that happened because of some structural issues, right? Because of the door not closing, because of people using, they didn't feel warm enough, right?
I would also mention, yes, the notion that they had to use a home heater is one thing, but you could go through many buildings in the Bronx and let the door close at a stairwell, and the simple springs that make the door close.
Right.
Don't exist. I have to tell you that next week on Bronx Talk, we will be talking about CLTs, community land trusts, and what you are suggesting implicitly as a solution is to keep the public ownership in the nature of housing. That I'm assuming that would be a concept you would think would fit here as a preventative measure, in addition to investing in Mitchell-Lama or whatever.
Right. Yeah. It's not a simple problem to solve, right? The problem of the fact that real estate is too valuable for people to live in. That's what it is, right? So when we're thinking back to the 70s, the problem is that that fires got out of control and that people were willing to engage in arson because the buildings had no financial value other than as an insurance payout. Of course, they had tremendous value of places where people lived and families were trying to continue. But financially, they had so little value that all they were worth was an insurance payout. Now they have so much value that it's very difficult to keep them at prices that normal people can afford to live in them. And they have so much value that they're actually more valuable as things to borrow against than as properties to own. I think a lot of us think of apartment buildings as, of course, just a place where most of us live. But then, so somebody owns it and they take care of it and they try to do as good as they can, and maybe they do or they don't keep up on the maintenance. Right. But that's not exactly an accurate way to understand them anymore. It's really more like they're stocks or something.
We're gonna have to run, but the illusion or silly us, we think that they're in it because if our plumbing breaks, that they're going to go replace the plumbing. But boy, does that eat into profits. And then they want another government handout to pay for the repairs. And you're never getting out of that. So, Eileen, one of the great values that we have in the Bronx is that we have journalists and reporters and op-ed writers like you to help alert us to this. And I found that piece you wrote in the Daily News was fascinating, was illuminating. And we just can't thank you enough for joining us and helping us fully understand another step of how we're going to get closer to solving some of these things.
Nice. Thanks so much, Gary. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
We appreciate it. Listen, we're going to take a short break, and then another young a journalist that I know, Eileen and others beginning to respect more and more, Robbie Sequara from the Bronx Times will join us, and we'll talk with some of the other Bronx issues with him. Don't go away.